As students of political science, you all know that the concept of power is central to political science. But then, in the understanding of power in political science, other social sciences have contributed. Keeping this in mind, I like to point out what power is and how it operates in this particular lecture. To first clarify what a concept denotes, we must point out that it directs our attention to expressions of a particular phenomenon, in this case power obviously. This is a very difficult problem actually to settle down to a perfect match between a word, that is a concept, and a particular part of reality which it wants to point out. The entire issue is further complicated by the fact that in political science, in fact in all social sciences, partly in the natural sciences also, we use words which are actually the concepts in the very specialized disciplines. So, the question is quite legitimate, why we do not rest with common sense and our everyday experience of power. The answer lies in the fact that all common sense and all everyday experience are bound to certain specific localities, certain specific instances and events, but because any knowledge system must be in a position to offer universal propositions, we just can't rely on common sense or everyday experience. We must hurry to add that we do not ignore them, because from them the illustrations come, and there is a very powerful contemporary movement in the social sciences which argue that common sense is as valid as a specialized sense. Immersed in this debate is the discussion of power today. Power requires a specialized understanding for the very simple reason that power has its disguises, and as somebody untrained in political science or in any other social science, it may be difficult to uncover power when it is just present in our own situation. What political science, like any other science, does is actually to unravel the various disguises in which power obtains in our midst. This it does in three ways. First, offering certain theories which situate power as a concept as a part of a larger argument. When you turn to a discussion of theories, I think you will have enough of illustrations to defend the position. But then it is not about having certain theories only, because since we have the burden of being a science, political science, we actually have to establish all our understanding on the strength of evidence meticulously collected. By meticulous collection, we obviously mean that we collect in a way that nobody suspects that we are being arbitrary. And as theories are being updated, so are methodologies which secure evidence, both quantitative and qualitative, in order to understand what power is, but it can be true about any other phenomenon in society. This is normal, the normal biography of any discipline. But then there is something else, and which is very vital in today's lecture, that a specialized discipline by itself may not be in a position to disclose all the aspects of any phenomenon. In our case today, it is power. Political scientists have started drawing on what you normally call the cognate social sciences, like say sociology, psychology, anthropology, history, economics, and if 50 years later I will be delivering this lecture, there could be few more cognate social sciences. The idea is like this: if a particular phenomenon, again to repeat power in our case, has multiple manifestations, some of which are very complex and subtle, then the vantage point of a particular discipline may not be adequate. So, for the sake of comprehensiveness of understanding, what we are trying to do is actually to organize interdisciplinary understanding of power. We all know that it could be a tall claim, but then at least we manage to combine two or one more discipline with political science, like we produce a political sociology or a political anthropology or political economy, and we gain in terms of our understanding of that particular phenomenon. So, the implicit pointer is this, that one may not fix the notion of power at one particular point, because the notion of power has been evolving and it is possible that it will continue to evolve. In the context of this dynamics of development of the concept and theories, we have to settle down to some consensus for the purpose of a classroom lecture, what power means, entails, etc., etc. I have indicated that there are so many theories, so many methodologies, so many other social sciences contributing to the understanding of power, but then if somebody should try to organize an overview, what is the upshot of this particular collaboration among social sciences, then one will point out a few things about power. Number one, power has many forms. Number two, power operates in more than one way. And number three, power has many sites in which it operates. If you manage to remember this particular overall statement throughout the lecture, you will discover that along this path we can situate all the theories, all the methodologies we have so far managed to produce. So, that would be the master statement, that power is not only universal, it can be located at places where you normally do not suspect there to be a power. But then the question of power has stimulated what is normally called a normative reaction. Actually, inquiry into power began in that particular original shape we called political philosophy. So, the question then becomes, why do we need a normative standpoint what is about to be scientific? Because there is actually a clash of intent between science and between a normative position, because the normative position is judgmental and science announces that it is not judgmental. The answer to this question is this, that despite all our eagerness to produce a science of politics, we have never disengaged ourselves from normative issues. This is true even today. And once again, as you disclose the individual theories, we come to know that actually each theory is about a particular normative position. For the time being, let me point out that power as a notion began on a path which is normally called the juristic path. It means that the initial firm notion about power, which has a certain appearance of being science rather than a philosophical position, took this particular form because power, we felt, would be the power of the state, and you actually devised another concept to denote the power of the state. We called it sovereignty. But since then, we have been actually interrogating the notion of sovereignty or the juristic understanding of power. Here, the normative position or the philosophical standpoint has played a very critical role. The argument is very simple in the sense that since power is unequally divided, those who are deprived of power, they actually engage those who are powerful in a certain kind of contention, and those who are already in power obviously are unwilling to give them a cakewalk. As a result of that, power struggles are unavoidable whenever there is power, and in social science the position is that one cannot point out a single social site which is powerless. We now like to shift over to a question: what is power? And the most elementary answer is that power is what power does. Then you have to discover what power does. But before we go to what power does, let me point out that power has a tendency of accumulating itself unless and until it is restrained. It can be restrained by a constitution or a legality, it can be restrained by the demands of real politics, or it can be restrained coming from, let us say, outside of a particular nation state. But then given a chance, power would always be aspiring after a limitlessness. There is a famous dictum that power tends to become absolute always until it is restrained. The whole history of politics, power being at the center, is actually the struggle over the question of power. Coming back to the question of what power does, the answer is what power does not do. That would require at least an elementary definition of power so that we can secure the understanding. Power is actually an ability to secure a compliance when the compliant has no way to resist it. This is not absolutely true. We will come to that a little later, but all power in all its forms always is distinguished by its ability to actually establish its command. So, the question is, how does this asymmetrical distribution of power, even in so called liberal democracy, secures compliance to its commands? There are many ways, and we will make the reference to the many ways one by one, never suggesting that the ways do not collapse into each other. And the same center of power can actually alter from technique A to technique B to technique C, or it can be permuted and combined in multiple ways. So, what we are doing simply is this: we are analytically separating how power secures compliance. The first answer, and the historically first answer, and despite all claims to democracy, it is still the final answer: power operates through the application of force. That force is physical force. That physical force can be naked physical force, which means which is not sought to be covered by any kind of legitimacy. This force has actually stimulated creation and improvement in a number of institutions of coercion, what you call normally repressive apparatus. For example, we have penal laws. To execute penal laws, internal security forces, to actually give it a cover of justiciability, a judiciary to look into the allegations, not always helping the victim though. That would mean that we have actually a nexus of power institutions, and it is universally true. Be it a pre-modern political system, be it a modern political system, or be it a post-modern political system, no system has actually survived, operated without institutions of physical power. So much so that it has actually been normalized in all kinds of theories. For example, in theories by a sociologist called Max Weber, or a post-structuralist called Michel Foucault, or if somebody would want to roll back to a Thomas Hobbes, nobody has denied the centrality of physical power. That is very interesting in the sense that the body is the original resource for the ruler and for the ruled, and the powers of the body are extended technologically. For example, I have gunpowder, I have a gun, for example, which actually adds to my muscle power. So, power, naked physical power has played a critical role in securing compliance. And what is much more remarkable, before the force is actually applied, even the threat that there can be a coercion would be enough to actually turn a whole community into a passive community. Such is the magic of power as violence, or power as force. But then increasingly it has become subtle. Why? Because there can be limits of use of naked power. It can be a moral limit, it can be that it is counterproductive, it sets into motion a civil war. So, you have to have a calculation of how much of naked force can be applied where and when. But then when you cannot apply naked force, obviously you still have to secure compliance. That can be done, that is done in two more ways. One is basically manipulating incentives, for example, rewards, and we all know that state has a mechanism of honoring dignitaries, of rewarding, and state reward can be one particular way of manipulating those who are the dissident voices into the lines of submission. It is much more subtle, and it does not in any case shed blood, because it does not shed blood, it is not visible either, and it does not provoke moral questions immediately, at least, unless somebody is very discerning. Number two, and which is again typical of our present times, it is a symbolic control or symbolic manipulation. For example, you appeal to nation when actually the rulers do not have the interest of the nation in mind. They have the interest of their own ruling power in mind, but then since people can be motivated, they can be swayed, they can even be mobilized in the name of a nation or class or democracy or war or liberation, then there is this symbolic manipulation which also secures compliance. I raise another question, that when we talk about power, whose power we have in mind, or to make it more sophisticated, to put it in a conceptual language, what are the agents of power, right? And the agents of power are many. For example, institutions and organizations, or it can be groups, or it can be individuals, or it can be a whole symbolic order. Look at the way the reference has been ranged, and you will probably notice that we have moved from the abstract to abstract, and between the two abstracts we have emerged the concrete cases. So, let us first begin with the question of institutions and organizations. Our normal example would be the state, because nothing like the state has actually displayed the acuteness of power. But I give you a preview that sooner or later we will talk about what we called powerless societies or acephalous societies, where you actually cannot single out the state or locate the state. Even then you find that power is actually in operation. But for the time being, we talk about the modern nation state, and that particular state is actually one critical agent of power. And despite all globalization, despite formation of regional alliances, the state has not disappeared. Despite a feeling that the state might disappear in the days of globalization, it continues to be still the most critical factor. But then you can now sort of decompose the state, and if you decompose the state, you will find that because the state is an idea, what gives concrete manifestation of the state is actually the government. So, whenever we talk about the agency called the state, we actually mean the agency called the government. But since we claim, and we cannot avoid making the claim, that power does not reside in the state only, then I must continue with illustrations of institutions or organizations which are agencies of power. Example 2, it can be economic institutions, for example cartels, or let us say chambers of commerce, or it can be little more invisible centers of economic power, and in the form of organization, overt or covert, they are also exerting power in all possible ways. The third example is obviously that of religion, and the church comes first, but there is no point we single out church. In fact, there has been no religious organization without a game of power involved, and you all remember that churches, temples, mosques have been sites of rivalry within the churchmen or the men in the mosque, and they could also engage in violence. And in fact, we have murder in the cathedral, that is the title of a famous piece of writing. So, never think that religion as an organization is actually devoid of power, that it believes in transcendence, but it never does. My fourth example would be the power, let us say, of the academia, the universities, the colleges, the schools, and then they also exude power in more than one way, and they can in fact collaborate with what we call the state. And once again I am giving a preview, say, of later positions which actually take the understanding of power out of the state into the non-state spheres. Now switch over to groups as agents of power. It can be the ruling class, it can be the hegemonic ethnic group, or it can be the elite, or it can be the masses which have managed to organize themselves, like in Cairo, for example. So, groups, they can be very vital political agents, and they crop up in course of any kind of political turmoil, and we have many famous examples of groups operating, mobs and crowds operating in course of French Revolution. And if you look at the global history, mobs and crowds play a very critical role in engaging what we call normally anomic violence. My third example would be the example of individuals. So, who are these individuals? These individuals can be the constitutional head, or it can be the elected leader like a prime minister, or he can be the secretary of the Communist Party of any particular country, right? Or he can be, let us say, a charismatic person like a Mahatma Gandhi, or in any moment one can be a charismatic person. We have a normal tendency to locate on those who turn out to be universally iconic like a Mahatma Gandhi or a Mao Zedong, but then you can have local heroes sometimes, always cropping up in course of any particular kind of political struggle or something like that. And finally comes the power of the symbolic order. The flag, the anthem, the songs of the revolution, and they all actually convey how the human mind is exceptionally susceptible to this actually invisible manipulation of their mind, and they always enjoy listening to music. And we all know that music has played a very critical role in almost all kinds of political rivalry and struggles. You probably recall that at the head of the army in previous times, you will be actually musicians playing to the fun of the soldiers who follow them. So that way there is also a symbolic way. To get back to the basic position once again, only for the purpose of understanding, I have made a separate reference to 4 possible agents of power. It does not mean that they do not collaborate, or they do not engage in conflict, or at the same site all of them may not be present. Actually, it is basically a case of an interlinked order of presentation of these 4 key actors in politics. But then see, this is the one side of the story, so to say the visible side of the story. We have something called the weapons of the weak, which means we basically argue that those who are weak, they are not actually vulnerable entirely, and they find ploys and they find strategies of actually trying to resist, or what is more popular in current social science, how to stay away from power, how to escape any governance. That way the story is very complex. I mean, the story of the agency is very complex, because there can be many kinds of agents, but only for the sake of argument we have presented a very classified version of the agents of power.